Please welcome Collin Hansen. Thank you so much. I think this talk might have been easier if I did come prepared to convert you to the prosperity gospel. I feel like Oprah up here. You get a car and you get a car. It'd be much easier. All right, so here's what we're going to do with the time that we have today. I want to share with you a couple of things about short-term missions that I've experienced. You'll see why. Give you a big picture for what the Gospel Coalition is trying to do with international outreach and sort of a look at the overall missions situation in general. Then I want to talk specifically about the program that we run at TGC called Theological Famine Relief for the global church, and then talk a little bit about why we do that in light of the prosperity gospel Mirage. So first, a tale of 2 short-term mission trips. I thought of this with you guys with your TCMP that David just mentioned, and I think one thing that's key on every mission trip that I've ever experienced, and I imagine that any of you have ever experienced, is that nothing goes as planned. It simply doesn't happen the way you expected it to. And on 2 different trips that I've been on, that's been true. One of them ended up being what I guarantee is the worst mission trip of all time. And the other did not go as expected, but turned out to go really well. All right, so the first one, the more interesting one, the worst mission trip of all time. I'll just share a few of the highlights on this. This was to the United Arab Emirates in 2011. I traveled with at the time, fledgling missions agency that I would highly recommend. I won't name them because you won't want to go with them if you hear about this, but they were early on at the time, and the main goal was to stop off in Dubai. Global, amazing city, a lot of church planting happening there, some real openness toward the gospel, especially with the international workers who are brought in there to do construction and households, tasks and things like that. But we were there, we were headed to a place called Al Ain, about 150,000 people. Amazing story. The basic gist of this is, back in the early 1960s, the tribal leaders in UAE, their daughters and their grandchildren were dying in childbirth. As recently as the 1960s, rates around 50% infant mortality and things like that. They'd heard nearby in Bahrain, some Christian missionary doctors who'd come, invited this group to come to Al Ain and to try to save their children, and ultimately they were able to. A missionary couple from Canada in particular there in Al Ain. Well, it turns out about a year afterward, they discovered oil in this part of the Arabian Peninsula, and that ended up launching what would become one of the wealthiest per capita countries in the world. There was a legacy of faith that was left by this missionary couple, which then gave them favor in the ruling family. So to this day, this Muslim ruling family on the Arabian Peninsula has paid for a hospital, a Christian hospital, where there's a lot of wonderful work being done. We were brought in there to teach on some issues of the Bible, a Bible formation, like canon development, all the stuff that you guys study. How does the Bible come together? It's a major issue in apologetics with Muslims, because they believe that the Bible, as opposed to the Quran, has been corrupted over the years, corrupted in various different ways through translations, through different manuscripts. So the job was to show them that it was not. Well, first of all, here's one of the key problems. None of us brought over there is an expert in any way, shape, or form on canon development. I had the easy task, which is the New Testament. That's still kind of a difficult topic, but compared to my boss's topic, which was the Old Testament, my task was pretty simple. My boss struggled. It was a difficult thing. And as if it wasn't bad enough to try to explain to a group of about 100 people how the Old Testament came together, we were kindly approached by a group who traveled about an hour and a half from Dubai to talk to us, to hear from us. And they came up to us in a break and said, we appreciate you guys being here, but what exactly are you trying to accomplish here? And we thought, well, we were just brought here to talk about how the Bible came together. They said, there's not a single person here who understands anything that you're saying. They might speak some English, but beyond that, their faith level is very rudimentary. These are not the questions that they're encountering. So we're fledgling on with a day-long conference Well, it turns out these were a lot of nurses from the hospital who were forced to be there as a part of their job. That's the only reason they stuck around. Next day, I start teaching to a group of about 100 people, and I can't even remember what the topic was. Working with my boss, teaching on these various different things. Well, first of all, there were several Western missionaries there who didn't like anything that we were saying, so they stood up to oppose us during those talks. That was awkward. I didn't know to expect that. Some denominational differences from the United States playing out overseas. Didn't have a great feeling about it, but then the next night when we had to shrink all of the different sessions into one session of about 20 people, I realized something really had gone wrong. By the third night, my boss actually refused to teach because there were 3 Filipino nurses left who were listening to us. And he just sat there and was like, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore, and just took pictures. So for posterity's sake, we have pictures of the 3 people who lasted out of the 100-some people who started. As if it couldn't get any worse. Let's just say our team leader, a few of the things that you should not do. Don't talk to single Islamic women, especially when you're talking to them about what used to happen in those big tents back in the olden days with the family. I don't even understand what's happening. Don't tell people that your dad planned the Iraq War invasion. Don't tell them that on the Arabian Peninsula. And don't ask everybody their take on Osama bin Laden. Okay, these are just general rules of thumb in case you go to this part of the world. These are not things I did. I'll just save myself a little face there. But they were things that I got to experience. Okay, so not a good trip. A good trip was one that I went on in Italy in 2013. Also completely unexpected what was going on there. The issue was, I thought I was going to go talk on revival. I'd written a book in 2010 called The God-Sized Vision, Revival Stories Throughout History and Around the World. And I thought I was going to give one talk, and I was tagging along with a couple other guys, and we were going to tour a number of different Italian cities, and I'd listen to them and give this one talk on revival, and then talk a little bit about the Gospel Coalition. Well, it turned out instead that they had set up a 10-city book tour for my revival book. I had no idea about. Thankfully, I was able to repeat the talk at several different places and I created a few different things on the fly. It was a wonderful thing because the topic of revival has strong roots in the Reformed theological tradition, even if it's not as prominent today, and very strong roots in the Pentecostal tradition. So in a lot of these cities, our trip was able to bring together different kinds of Christians who don't normally cooperate in those cities. Among many other things, it was actually when I got to know Connor Osprey when I came back, and as he talked about some of his own travels to Italy, as I wrote about that. And I share all that essentially just to say that what makes a difference on these trips that I know Beeson does such a good job of preparing you for is, one, preparation ahead of time to know what you're getting yourself into. Second, local coordination. Trying not to jump in and try to impose what you think they need, but to talk to people locally on the ground to find out what they actually want. You're trying to actually meet a need. That was a major problem in our case. We brought something that people didn't want. But in the second case, we did in Italy, we were able to bring a need, which was to help manage some unity and bring some unity within the church there. And finally, you need some expertise, some understanding of that local context, which we simply lack. So I'm grateful for the Global Center and all the things that they do to help prepare and to ensure these successful trips for your CCMP. Again, things will always go wrong, but those steps will really help you in the meantime. So let me give you a kind of big picture from the individual experience, a big picture look at what we mean at TGC by international outreach, or the essential situation. So there's a crisis of purpose in Western missions, which is basically twofold. One, does the world still need us? And second, does it still want us? Related but distinct questions. Does the world still need us, and does it still want us? Well, 75% of Christians now, as I'm sure you're aware, are living in the global south, between Africa, Asia, and South America. And I think as you look at the conditions within the Western church today, you're inclined to think that maybe this whole thing was reversed. Maybe they ought to be coming here and bring the power of the Spirit with them. We see a lot of the dynamic, exciting things that are happening around the world, and wondering in many cases why we don't see them in the United States, or especially places like Western Europe. I think, though, in light of that, I think there's a parallel here, not a perfect parallel, but something to consider between when Paul is talking about, the Apostle Paul is talking about the legacy of the Jews. What do the Jews have in Romans 3? What advantage then does the Jew have in light of the coming of Christ and the outpouring of the Spirit upon the Gentiles? Similarly, what advantage then do we have as Westerners in light of a situation where it seems like the center of the church is clearly moving to the south? Well, one, I think it's pretty clear we have some significant advantages when it comes to resources. Certainly I'm thinking about money here, but also what's made possible by money, which is in many cases time. Think about just what it takes to be able to have the kind of leisure time to write theology, to read theology, to study church history, to write textbooks on these things. Luxuries that many church leaders around the world simply don't have. And also, we live in a time of unprecedented, easy international travel, but it still costs. It may not cost nearly as much proportionally, but it still costs money. Money that many churches are willing to spend here in the West on the kind of short-term trips that I just talked about. But I think just in general, those are a couple advantages that we have in the West. Advantages that I understand to be obligations for us toward trying to help and to assist our brothers and sisters around the world. And I don't think those changes are going to go away anytime soon, though you do see places in the global south rapidly closing the gap in those areas. I'd also say another advantage that we have in the West that burdens us to try to help is history. I think what this means is not necessarily that we have everything figured out, but that we've made a lot of mistakes. We have done a lot of things wrong. We have entertained a lot of heresies. We've seen the damaging effects of them. And so I think there are ways that we can help other people from falling into those same patterns, from making the same mistakes that we or our ancestors have made. I was thinking recently about a preacher who was sharing this novel interpretation of how we shouldn't be focusing on the Bible, but that we should be focusing on the resurrection. Because after all, nobody's faith should fall apart just because they found out that the Bible's wrong about a bunch of stuff, if so long as the resurrection is true. And I thought, that is not novel in any way, shape, or form. That has been perpetuated for centuries in the West. But again, with historical amnesia, or in other parts of the world where they simply might not have dealt with these things, some of the things like theological liberalism are novel and cutting edge, where we've been like, that was debunked in the 1870s, or that led to this in Germany in the early 1900s, or something like that. So resources in history are a couple examples where I think ongoing in the West, we have an obligation and opportunity to continue to help guide. Guide in the sense of, I think in many ways, come alongside. I don't see this as necessarily thinking we have all the answers that we can simply export to them, but merely an opportunity for us to come alongside what God is doing around the world. I think this is very clearly in obedience to the aspect of the Great Commission that is not as common for us to talk about in Matthew 28:20, where it describes teaching them, Jesus' commission to teach them to observe all that I have commanded you. We talk a lot about the baptism, we talk a lot about conversion, but do we understand what it means to teach believers to obey everything that Jesus has commanded us? A good book that I would recommend for more on this aspect of fulfilling the Great Commission would be by David Sills. It's called Reaching and Teaching, A Call to Great Commission Obedience. I'll get into a little bit more of why I think that's helpful, but overall, I think it's difficult because in the West, we are typically so obsessed with numbers, obsessed with results. That's what tends to attract money, and that's what tends to attract attention, rather than that difficult work of discipleship, trying to help people to obey everything that Jesus commanded. So within that context, I want to talk then about specifically theological famine relief and what that looks like for the Gospel Coalition. Our ministry has been around about 11 years, since 2005. You can go to our website, tgc.org, and you can look at our foundation documents. That's a theological vision for ministry, which is an explanation of how our confessional statement works itself out. It's probably the most distinctive thing about TGC. A lot of organizations have confessional statements that say, we believe this, we don't believe this, or just laying out, this is what we affirm. But we actually try to apply it in a contextualized way to what that should look like in our local churches. Now, mind you, that's contextualized for 2005 in the United States, and North America more broadly, Canada in particular. So it's not meant to be some kind of eternally binding document, but it's meant to say in our time and age, we believe this is what gospel faithfulness looks like. I'll give you an example. I'll just read you one example of what that looks like from our theological vision. The theological vision was originally drafted by our vice president and co-founder, Tim Keller, and then was then sort of edited and debated by our council, about 50 different founding council members from Baptist, Presbyterian, and Anglican backgrounds, and also Free Church and Independent. This statement comes from our theological vision. We must work for the eternal and common good and show our neighbors we love them sacrificially, whether they believe as we do or not. Indifference to the poor and disadvantaged means that there has not been a true grasp of our salvation by sheer grace. So you see there a very reformational statement, a true grasp of our salvation by sheer grace, but also the application for our time and age to show that how this ought to lead us toward love and care and sacrifice for those who lack in certain resources compared to what many of us do in the West. So that helps us understand a little bit of what we're getting at here. But specifically, we are focused on education, and specifically on gospel teaching and training church leaders. We have, within the international scope of the Gospel Coalition, we try to make a distinction. We avoided calling this Gospel Coalition international because we don't exercise any authority from the United States over any of our sister ministries around the world. It's a key distinction. So what's happening in Australia, what's happening in Canada, France, Germany, and especially the Spanish-speaking world happens with its own leadership. So in places like Canada and Australia, where, of course, they're speaking English, they've taken the name of the Gospel Coalition, but they've modified their documents. They have their own leaders, and we don't exercise any control over them from the United States. Then the Spanish-speaking world, likewise, their own council, their own foundation documents. So there's a certain fidelity there, a partnership, a brotherhood, but there's not control. That's a recognition that it's a mistake that we've made in the past in the West, where the church has sought to control as if we can possibly understand what the needs are. I'll give you an example. A big thing that we're really focused on in the United States is faith and work, integrating our faith throughout all different aspects of our lives. Well, this has been, for various reasons, a major sticking point in Australia. And they basically just flat out said, we don't buy any of that stuff. We're getting rid of all of it. Okay, so that's what they did. So they have a little bit of a different emphasis and overall commonality, but some significant differences. It's our motivation then for what we can do in the West in a way that would be helpful along the lines of what I talked about before starts from a recognition that 85% of the 2.2 million evangelical churches worldwide are led by pastors with insufficient training. 85% out of 2.2 million evangelical churches. Now, the phrase insufficient training can be a little bit fuzzy. What exactly does that mean? I can't actually define that for you. I'm not exactly sure. But here's what and I think in some ways it can also sound judgmental, as if somehow pastors in the United States are all sufficiently trained. We know that just personally, that none of us ever feels fully competent to do what we've been called to do. But here's just a way of putting it. Internationally, the church, the evangelical church at large, is spending a tiny fraction on training its ministers compared to what we in the United States and we here at Beeson Divinity School are spending, what you are spending on your own training. So the basic question I simply have to ask is, if quality training is necessary for us, why would we not want it for other people around the world? Or to put it negatively, if it's good enough for them, why wouldn't it be good enough for us? I mean, why are we bothering with any of this? We believe that training is important. Otherwise, you wouldn't be investing 3 or 4 years of your life to be doing it. You wouldn't be saving up. We wouldn't be raising money to find sponsors and to find grants and taking out loans and things like that. So we're spending a small fraction on training pastors around the world compared to the United States. We believe it's important, and we're trying in some ways to close that gap with some of the most cost-effective means that we can. So here's how we do it in terms of theological famine relief. We do this through publishing books. I'll show a video here in a second that gets at this, but going back to what we talked about originally, we're trying to connect with sources in the field on their needs. We're well connected internationally with both missionaries as well as indigenous church leaders who can tell us this is the kind of challenge that we're dealing with. And in a lot of cases, the leaders, at least national leaders, are broadly familiar with the resources the evangelical church has produced globally. So they understand this book would be very helpful in our context. Can you help us to translate? Or in many cases, they're already speaking English. Think about a country like Nigeria with an English colonial history where we don't have the same language barrier. So we go from there, finding out what are the local needs. And second, we coordinate with publishers, both domestic and foreign, on available titles. So a lot of the publishers are very generous. Now, this is kind of a controversial thing because publishers have to make money to be able to support themselves. There have been a lot of controversies about this, and you can see this also when you come across medicine or anything else when you're talking about international aid. So we coordinate with the publishers who in many cases are very charitable to make these titles available in translation or in English. We then at the Gospel Coalition raise money from our readers, from people who go to our conferences and things like that. Out of their generosity, then they want to be able to provide for pastors around the world. We then go ahead and try to secure the translation in many cases, or like I said, in English. And then the last step, which I want to talk about, I'll show you a video now, is to raise awareness for short-term trips. That's why I started off talking about those different short-term trips, and I want to focus on that for how you guys can participate in this through your CCMP. We raise awareness that we have these resources available so that when you go, you can pack hope, that you can take some of these books along to distribute to these pastors for free. The only cost that you pay is for the shipping. You don't pay anything for the books. So I'll go ahead and show this video.
Pastors and church leaders love books. The Bible itself, books about the Bible, about the church, about the gospel. Now, imagine that you are a pastor of a local church. You have received little training. You have a Bible and a pastor friend or two, but only a few Christian books in your language. You have limited internet access, and yet every week you are responsible for feeding and leading your people. So one day, a brother from overseas arrives with good biblically sound books, solid food as you help feed and lead your congregation. That is what we at the Gospel Coalition call theological famine relief for the global church. Today, 75% of the global church lives on the continents of Africa, Asia, and South America. But an estimated 85% of evangelical churches worldwide are led by pastors or church leaders with little or no training. By getting good books into the hands of church leaders all over the world, we can help address this theological famine in a big way. We partner with translators, publishers, and missions networks to provide access to thousands of gospel-centered books in dozens of languages, all made available for free. And we found the best way of delivering these books is to equip pastors around the world by sending them with the people who are already being sent. You, your church, your missions team. So if you're planning to travel overseas, we have free biblical resources ready for you to take along. Go to packinghope.io. Select the language, pick the title you need, and click Take It Now. The books are free, you just pay for shipping. In some cases, you'll pack the books and bring them over. In other cases, the books are already waiting for you in country. We donate, you deliver. God is building his church. He's calling some to send and some to go. When you go, pack hope.
All right, so basically summarized a lot of the things that I already said there. I think it's necessary to talk about why books. I mean, especially in this internet age, my job at the Gospel Coalition is to oversee all of our publications, most of which is online. Why are we focused on books? I think it's important to emphasize that internet access is just simply not as common as you might expect in a lot of places, especially within the global South. I also think there's a fascinating quote I wanted to share from Samuel Zwemer, the famous missionary to the Muslim world, that describes what kind of the long-lasting effect can be of a printed book. He said, "The printed page is a missionary that can go anywhere and do so at minimum cost. It enters closed lands and reaches all strata of society. It does not grow weary, it needs no furlough. It lives longer than any missionary. It never gets ill. It penetrates through the mind and the heart and the conscience. It has and is producing results everywhere. It is often laying dormant, yet retained its life and blossomed later." So in the last 10 years of TGC's international outreach, we've shared 500,000 resources in 136 countries in 40 different languages, just making the smallest dent in what we see as a global problem. And what kind of books are we sharing? We started with international outreach before it was part of the Gospel Coalition ministry. We started with Desiring God, founded by John Piper. So a lot of the books that we produce are by John Piper. But also, kind of the ultimate goal is to continue to produce resources that are written by locals for locals, the same way that we would have that privilege, thousands and thousands of historical titles here in the United States. But in order to jumpstart that process, in many cases, we're translating stuff that's already been in circulation here in the United States. The last thing I wanted to talk about then is how all of this relates to the prosperity gospel Mirage. You guys are well educated in international missions to understand that some of what I'm describing here could be regarded as perhaps condescending, for colonial, representing some of the difficult parts of colonialism. I think it's helpful though to understand what we're up against when I talk about this. And the first question to ask then is, where did the prosperity gospel originate? And where did it start? You're probably aware that it started here. It's based out of the United States. This is where it was conceived, and I don't think there's another nation on earth that ever could have come up with the prosperity gospel except this country that is so awash in consumerism and built on the love of money. And I also want to ask then, how much money do you think has been raised to spread the prosperity gospel around the world via cable television? In fact, is there any other kind of Christianity, for the most part, that's exported? I mean, we don't live in the age of Billy Graham any longer, when he was the kind of one global figure in the kind of rising age of television. Now, virtually everything you see is from prosperity gospel. And a lot of people have asked me, in my position, why is it you can't get better stuff on television? And the major reason you can't is because you have to raise a ton of money to be able to get on television. Compared to the internet, compared to printing books, compared to anything else, you're buying time. I mean, nobody is doing, there's not a charity. I mean, they're buying air time. The radio works the same way. And so who is it that has all the money to be able to buy the airtime? The prosperity gospel preachers. Why? Because if you send in this $10 seed of faith, it will guarantee blessings in your life. Okay, so the game is rigged on that side. I can't get into all the details about the prosperity gospel. I'm assuming that you think it's a problem. But if you don't, I want to encourage you to check out a couple different articles. I'll just mention them here. If you just look at our website, search the prosperity gospel, you'll come across them. They're two of the best read articles that we've ever done, which I think indicates a lot of the popularity of the prosperity gospel locally, nationally and internationally, but also they indicate just how dangerous it is. One is by a guy named Sean DeMars. It's called The Gospel That Almost Killed Me. And he's describing how he, for a long time, refused to see doctors because he believed that his faith ought to have been sufficient for healing him of whatever diseases. The Gospel That Almost Killed Me, by Sean DeMars. Another is from a pastor in Kenya who for 17 years, I get choked up, for 17 years taught the prosperity gospel. And it's how God saved me from the prosperity gospel. You'll see why. He lost 2 children and was told by the people he'd been preaching to that it must be because of his sin. And it must be because of his lack of faith. It's just, that's why we do what we do, because what people believe affects how they live. And it's the kind of thing that makes you want to kill yourself when it doesn't go right. And because it's not consistent with the biblical gospel, of course it's not going to go right. So I think, just generally speaking, we're talking about the prosperity gospel Mirage and why we're doing this. Ultimately, you have to ask yourself the question, do you believe in a locally contextual? The Gospel Coalition is all about proper contextualization. Do you believe in a locally contextual and yet globally comprehensible gospel? You can go wrong both ways. You can go wrong by only describing the globally comprehensible gospel, which is going to lead you toward a modern, Western, truncated, therapeutic, in many cases, whether you know it or not, gospel. It's going to be dressed in a dark suit, and it's going to expect certain songs from a certain time in American history. So you ultimately, you can go wrong by focusing too much on the global comprehensibility of the gospel, which just turns out to be what you have understood in your context. Or you can go wrong in saying that everything's relative, that all gospel is locally contextual, and so therefore if the prosperity gospel works, that's the gospel. If something else works in China that fuses with Confucianism, then that works. If something else works as a hybrid, the insider movement in the Middle East, then that works. Ultimately, you have to hold these two things in tension. Is the gospel then both locally contextual, as you see in something like Paul's preaching the gospel in Mars Hill in Acts 17? But you also see then that Paul himself preached only one gospel, that gospel that you read about in 1 Corinthians 15, the resurrection. So there may be a different emphasis, a new insight, and an unfamiliar cadence. When you go out on these CCMPs, the goal is not just to teach all these other people what you've learned here at Beeson, but also to learn from these other people, what they can show you in their faith. But ultimately, you're going to see the same conviction of sin, same redemption at the cross, the same hope of resurrection, the same promise of Christ's return wherever you go. And that's where I would judge the prosperity gospel to be seriously wanting. Our ultimate goal then, I want to read then a quick quote here from David Sills. I mentioned him earlier in Southern Seminary, his book Reaching and Teaching, called The Great Commission Obedience. Here's what we're working toward. Sills writes, every people group must have the Bible in a language they can understand. They should have biblically qualified and trained pastors. They should have their own theologians and authors who are well equipped to reflect on the scriptures in the context of their people's worldview and write in their heart language. This ideal world will not exist until we obey our commission to disciple disciplers, train trainers, and teach teachers. Nationals will one day be the best teachers, theologians, authors, and preachers for their national church, but only after they have been prepared. The background developed through generations of being steeped in pagan worldviews and false religions does not evaporate on praying a prayer of salvation. This is why Christ commanded us to disciple them. I think it's a compelling vision. I encourage you to check out more of it in that book. And so a closing action point here for you. I know a lot of students here at Beeson are considering a PhD. I've been in those conversations, considered that myself. One thing you'll often hear is that if you're planning to get a PhD and stay and teach in a seminary or even in a Bible college or a Christian university here in the United States, the odds are not good for you to land a job in that regard. And so there should be a healthy dose of skepticism before you follow that path. However, I have heard then the tune change dramatically when you say something along the lines of, but actually I was thinking about going overseas to help train other pastors and raise up indigenous scholars. All of a sudden, it becomes a very viable option if you can afford it and you have the time. But I would also say that when you merely graduate with an MDiv, which is the degree that I hold, you are still far more privileged, certainly than almost anybody else here in the United States, let alone most pastors around the world. You still have an excellent opportunity to share what you've learned here at Beeson with church leaders around the world. A perfect example of this would be my friends Ryan and Aubrey Martin. I'm sure a lot of you know them. Ryan just graduated last year. He was actually just with us last night at Redeemer Community Church over in Avondale. He and Aubrey are with United World Mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I'd encourage you to consider that option of going overseas to train the pastors, to help share what you've benefited from for that they just have not been able to have the time, 3 or 4 years and that kind of money to travel to the West, and they don't have any options locally, especially in a place like Democratic Republic of Congo. So the future growth of the church, I think it's safe to say, it probably won't be in the United States. That doesn't seem to be where the Spirit is most dynamic right now. And yet I think we can still recognize the privilege we have of our publishing and of our education. I'd encourage you to find opportunities through Packing Hope, through Theological Famine relief, or especially through going yourself and teaching in these settings, to share what you've learned with those less educated, even as they inspire you with their understanding of God's Word, their faith, and their trust in our Savior. Thanks. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, please go ahead and take some questions. We definitely have time. And can you repeat, so they can hear on the recording, can you repeat the question?
Go ahead, Dr. Divine.
Collin, I don't agree with this. David said that he thought you looked a little bit like you did.
As only Mark Divine can pull off that kind of compliment.
I recovered from the trauma of that, and I disapprove that you told me that. But can you tell us?
A young Newt Gingrich, at least?
Well, I don't know.
Okay, current Newt Gingrich, that'd be a problem. Okay, I need to get a haircut.
You mentioned that in Australia, they don't hear anything about the faith and work. Do you know anything about why they were so resistant to that?
I would encourage you to talk to Beeson alum Chase Kuhn about that. He is the one who's done the most informing of me on that subject. I'm glad you followed up on that. It does show some of the examples. In Australia, the church is much smaller. The evangelical church is much smaller than it is in the United States. And they believe that ultimately all resources must be invested in evangelism. That simply there isn't going to be a church left unless they engage in intense evangelism. So they are very keen on every promising young Christian being steered heavily toward evangelistic and local church ministry for essentially the health of the church. They see, now of course, you and I, Mark, have worked on the event that Keller's coming to talk about on Faith and Works, so we know where we're coming down on this. They believe that it is a uniquely American notion to focus so much on making money for Jesus, is how they would describe it.
It does strike me that neither of us are as evangelistic as we should be.
That's a good point, Mark.
Maybe we're to blame for something.
Sorry, did everybody hear that? I forgot to repeat it. Did you hear? Okay. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, so I grew up in pseudo-prosperity-ish gospel circles, and as I began to study and kind of make my way out, my friends in those circles who would accept my critiques would ask a question like, well, isn't this type of teaching, although it's iffy, better than no teaching? So is the expansion of the prosperity gospel better than the expansion of no gospel?
I don't think I've ever thought of that before. I guess the question is it easier in the South, and this might not be a perfect parallel, so just work with me on this, is it easier in the South to evangelize somebody who believes he's a Christian because he professed faith at age 12, was baptized, has never been back to church, beats his wife, never goes to work, cheats on his taxes, and all that sort of stuff, than it is to evangelize somebody who has never pretended to be a Christian? I would say experientially, it's more difficult in the former than it is in the latter. I think there's something about a little bit of false gospel that seems in many ways to inoculate you against the true thing. That's not to underestimate the power of the Spirit to convert anybody that he wants. It's just to say that I guess in prosperity gospel, it's not always necessarily an entirely different gospel, as in like with Mormonism or something like that. And there are different degrees of it. So that's where I would qualify what I'm saying earlier and just say, it depends on the degree of it. Is it a lighter prosperity gospel that seems to just make more of faith healings and God's desire for us to flourish in all aspects of our lives? Or is it something that basically, just like I was talking about, ruins people by telling them that if anything goes wrong in their lives, it must be their fault? And I always wonder, death comes to us all. It's going to be proven wrong. So I guess generally I would say it depends on where it falls on the spectrum. But generally we have to be very careful, because it seems like those who are convinced in their self-righteousness are often worse than those who don't know anything about Jesus at all.
What is the relationship between this endeavor and some of the education endeavors that are already kind of happening on the ground in some of these countries?
Yeah, so what are we doing to connect with the education endeavors that are already happening on the ground? That's pretty much all that we work with. So it's local leaders, either the missionaries who are running these things or the local leaders who are the ones who are requesting the books. In many cases, they don't have the money. They know the needs. They have the distribution channels. So essentially, we don't have our own distribution channels. We are only working through what's already happening over there. So, which I think, basically anywhere you go, there's something good happening. You just got to be able to have the connections to find it.
Is there a way for people that would like to participate in Packing Hope but don't have the resources to be able to go on a trip, like church members or something like that don't have time to take out of 2 weeks of work or something like that, but would like to help supply books to other people? Is there a way?
Is there a way they can help? Well, certainly they can donate. Yeah. So that's the easiest way to do it, and to raise awareness. So if your church has other people going on mission trips, then to just make them aware of this possibility. To say, you guys are already going, you're already bringing this sort of stuff. Why not just bring some books along with you? So great question. Thanks for asking.
So obviously, you guys don't want to raise up a bunch of John Pipers, even though that John Piper is awesome. He's great. His works are really beneficial. You do want them to flourish in their own unique way. How do you see your efforts in raising up a contextualized gospel language for them? There's a lot. We have a long tradition of language in the West, of Orthodox language.
Right.
And so how will you be raising up an Orthodox language in their own communities, in their own contextualized? How do you see your work in aiding that? Because some people might critique and say, oh, you're just expanding the Western thought as opposed to necessarily the gospel.
Yeah, so how do we try to help build toward that contextualized understanding? I would say in some languages we're way ahead on that. Like in Spanish, we're way ahead on that. We just came out with a line of books in Spanish, most of them written by Spanish speakers, especially out of Santo Domingo and the Dominican Republic. That's kind of the most place where we have the most work in. Our Spanish site has an equivalent of my position, an editorial director, a good friend of mine, Jairo Namnoon, in Santo Domingo. So so in Spanish, we're already well ahead of that game. We're not doing nearly as much translation there. We did translate Tim Keller's books several of them, but they're way ahead of the game on a lot of that stuff there. Elsewhere, part of what we're trying to do is simply do two things. One, to raise the theological awareness level from almost nothing to something. So that's part of what we're doing. And then in other cases, we're trying to give them explicit resources to combat something like prosperity gospel that is dominant in their context. So it's a much bigger endeavor to figure out how in all these different languages we're able to do that. We have a lot going on in Portuguese as well, based out of Brazil, but a lot of that was already happening without anything that we were doing. So we just kind of come alongside and translate a few things. So I hope we'll catch up in some other languages, but overall, we'll probably keep focusing just on those places that are dealing with acute threats of counterfeit gospels, and then also where the awareness level is simply nothing, where a pastor just doesn't even have a single book on his shelf.